Imagination. So with this daunting task ahead of me, we shall begin. Now I'm going to go at light speed because we have a lot of people here who may not know what we have been up to over the last 20 years. What I'm going to try to do is to lay out, as I said, the case for structures built by someone on worlds which surround us. And the implied extension of that is the implication of those structures. In fact, that's what we're all here this morning to discuss. If this is all real, if over the last 20 years the NASA data and the independent analysis has in fact shown us real stuff out there, then what does it mean? I want to thank Chris Gould. This is a brilliant, brilliant synthesis of seminal ideas. Some of you may recognize the figures at the top. Some of you may recognize the figure in the center. But what you may not know is that this derives directly. I mean, Steven Spielberg did not originate E.T.'s finger touching humankind. It was a gentleman a bit more removed named Michelangelo, who for 12 years, lying on his back, painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, limbed out the potentials between the ineffable in some other space, some other dimension, some other reality, reaching out and breathing life, literally, into mankind. Now, that's what we're here to discuss today. That painting is in the Sistine Chapel, as I noted a moment ago, which, of course, is in this place. This is St. Peter's in Rome, in the Vatican, a place where a few days ago a very interesting ceremony took place, the 25th anniversary of the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. It is Rome which is, in every essence, the center of Christendom, of people who believe in a divine origin of Jesus Christ, of that ineffable reaching out and touching mankind in a very literal way. It is also Rome which is the center of other things. For instance, in addition to this side of Rome, there is this side of Rome. And as a matter of fact, when Mike and I kind of put this all together, I must say that there were times in thinking of what we were going to do in coming here that I felt a little bit like this. Now, anybody recognize this picture? Charlton Heston, all right? Ben-Hur. Who has not seen Ben-Hur 15, 20 times? Please raise your hand. What you don't know is that those chariots have very deep symbolic meaning. Now, for those of you who have followed our work over the years, you know that one of the things that we have gotten involved in addition to the science and the data and following the numbers, is following the ritual. It turns out that this discussion of the interface, the boundary between religion and this other solar system reality, is very ancient. In fact, we're going to have some discussion in the next couple of hours by David Flynn of just how ancient and how extraordinary that connection has been. David is doing some pretty interesting work, and I'm looking forward to what he's going to say to us this morning, because one of the things that he's going to touch upon is the background to those chariot races. Because this guy is none other than Mars, the god of war, who was in essence the patron god of Rome, of the Roman Empire. Now, this is a statue that was raised shortly after Julius Caesar was killed in a temple dedicated to Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, Mars who was called upon to avenge the death of the Roman emperor, which set in motion a whole series of historical events and created ultimately the greatest empire that up until that time the world had ever seen. Well, that empire, the Roman Empire, was dedicated to none other than the planet Mars. Now we flash forward the film. This is 2003, fall. This has been the year of Mars because of all times in the past 60,000 years, On the evening of August 27th of this year, Mars came closer than it's been for some 60,000 years. 6 times 10,000 years. I mean, that's an extraordinary, unimaginable amount of time. It is our potential position, and I say that carefully, that a lot of interesting history to which we are now just beginning to be privy has taken place in those 60,000 years. And in fact, the last time Mars was that close, very different perspectives and very different sets of eyes from this planet and from other planets watched that event, marked its passing in a way that modern history does not record. This is Mars as it appears in the night sky. In the late 20th century, early 21st century, Mars, as you can see, this was a shot taken on the 17th of July of this year with an amateur telescope from Florida as Mars passed behind the moon, as seen that night from that strip of real estate on planet Earth. Mars appears no bigger than an average crater on the moon. So for all of recorded history for the last, 6,000 years or so, and certainly within scientific history, the last couple hundred years or so, after the invention of the telescope and the perfection of that kind of technology, all that we thought we knew about that place has been gained from a disk that you can literally cover in a telescope with your little finger, even with some of the highest magnification. What we need to do to change our perspectives historically from looking at it far away is to create a whole new technology, namely the space age, which of course in 1976 sent 2 unmanned Viking probes for the first time to land on Mars. And what did the orbiters that didn't land but kept cruising around taking pictures, what did they discover? But one afternoon on July 25th, I believe, 1976, they took a picture of a region called Cydonia, a picture that looked like this. And because it looked so extraordinarily different than any scientists at JPL or NASA or Caltech or wherever had ever imagined, what happened to that view? Well, the first reaction, the first official reaction, I heard myself. I was a member of the press. I was working for CBS, and I was also a NASA consultant back then. I was in the JPL press room, Von Karman Auditorium, when Jerry Soffin, who was the Viking project scientist, said, when this picture was popped up on the screen, "Isn't it peculiar what tricks of lighting can do?" When we took a second image a few hours later, it all went away. That has been the position of NASA for the last 30-some years. It all went away. Now, what I'm going to show you is that the data has not gone away. In fact, with each new mission, with each new set of images, with each new discipline applied to this problem, and we'll talk about what we mean by disciplines, because there's a range of technologies now that have been brought to bear on this problem, not just imaging. The problem of the face on Mars has not gone away. It's gotten deeper, more profound, more provocative, and more insidious. What do I mean by insidious? What I mean is a polarization between the official view, the political view of an agency and a government that cannot countenance that this could possibly be real, and a public and a band of independent scientific investigators who for the last 20-some years have been pursuing, sometimes at great cost and against great odds and great opposition, the truth. The simple scientific truth. Is this thing a real artifact lying on a place where it does not belong? And if it is such an artifact, what does it mean, both scientifically, politically, philosophically, and the reason we're all here this morning, religiously? This quote from, of course, Genesis is a profound perspective on the problem, because what it does is canonize the particular religious perspective that human beings and the human likeness of human beings is endemic to one place only, namely here. So if you find an image, particularly an image of such striking, astonishing likeness to a human image, lying in a place where it has no business being, namely there, what does it do to this perspective? We have two very noted authors with us today, scientists, researchers, theologians, men of curiosity, depth, and perspective, to tell us what they think this could mean if the data is accepted as bona fide. What I'm going to do in the next hour and 15, 20 minutes is to give you my perspective on what it can mean, because from the data that I'm going to show you, I would say now that I'm probably 99% convinced that it's real, and this quote must be addressed in its full dimension for the human condition and the future of all of us on planet Earth. Now, there's another perspective, which is the scientific perspective. You have your religious people, namely the folks that say that God created man here and nowhere else. And then you have scientists. Now, this is from George Gaylord Simpson, who was one of the seminal evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. I quote him extensively in The Monuments of Mars because his perspectives really encapsulated a whole scientific point of view. Let me quote what he said. Among all the myriad forms of matter and of life on Earth, as far as we know in the universe, man is unique. He happens to represent the highest form of organization of matter and energy that has ever happened. Now, I find a striking parallel between that statement and this statement. I mean, a parallel which is eerie. These two points of view, faith and science, when it comes to the human condition, when it comes to man, an old term obviously including all of us, basically have one perspective, that we're it, that we are unique, one of a kind. In fact, there are some people among us who I have heard recently state that out of the literally trillions of possible worlds in the universe available to the Hubble technology, this is it. So please enjoy lunch today. I mean, you guys are the only ones that will, according to this perspective. Now, when you look at the Earth in its proper context, set against the background of just one galaxy, the Milky Way, of something between 100 and 400 billion suns, I just have a problem with the idea that we're that unique, just philosophically. I think Carl in Contact phrased it best when he had Ellie and her father, have these colloquies through time. Then when she met him, in that other dimension, wherever she went, and he looked up and she looked up and he said, if we're all there is, it's an awful waste of space. I mean, if the biblical quotation, the heavens declareth his handiwork, has any meaning, it's got to be beyond just 400 billion suns in this galaxy alone. The universe, stars, has been there a long time, will be there a very long time. So what is so special about it that it declareth his handiwork? Now, if you add the idea of intelligence, if you add the idea of cosmic soap opera, I mean, that's something extraordinary, at least to my perspective. Because that gives you now 400 billion in this galaxy alone, remember, out of trillions of galaxies, 400 billion stages for consciousness to appreciate what's going on in this cosmos that from that perspective has been created for intelligence. So that's part of what I think is going to happen in our discussion tonight, because I am of the opinion very firmly, even before I found the data that I'm presenting, that there is a lot more going on in heaven and earth than has been dreamed of in many, many, many philosophies, which brings us back to this. Because when I tripped over this back in 1983, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming, as I describe in Monuments, to the position that this in fact could be real, because I was a kind of a devotee of this Gaylord Simpson point of view, which is I'd bought into the evolutionary model that it took trillions of random steps to create what we see around us, and the odds that anything like that could ever be randomly created again were literally astronomical. But if you take out the random part, if you begin to look that there's something else going on, that there's an intelligence, maybe with a big I, maybe with a small I, but there's intelligence imbued in that structure, things completely change. So, this is the place that Lowell viewed through his telescopes and drew lines and canals and imagined that maybe there was someone home at the dawn of the last century. When I say that, I mean now not the 19th, but the 20th century. It's hard to imagine we're 3 years into the 21st century and it takes you 2 hours to go through an airport. Anyway, on this planet, there is a region called Cydonia. This Cydonia is the one on Mars. It was named by Giovanni Virginio Schiaparelli. As I began to do the research and put together the various teams of the independent investigation and do the science that NASA had demonstrably not done, and we'll get to that in a minute, and ultimately summarized all of this in the first editions of the Monuments of Mars back in 1987, one of the things that I was struck by very early on was, if this is real, if this guy is real, then somehow, if the Simpson model holds, and human beings are unique to here, or if the religious model holds, and God created mankind here, if you find a statue next door, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, well, actually it does take a rocket scientist, to get us there, you know. But it doesn't take somebody with lots of brains to figure out that maybe, just maybe, us guys made it. And it is trying to tell us guys something more than we know now. So at the very essence of the problem, there has got to be, potentially, a connection between this place, this Cydonia, and planet Earth. And that is what I wrote in the first edition back in 1987 of the Monuments of Mars. In fact, this was the chapter that I wrote describing my search. And I started it with a quote because I just thought, you know, Arthur's an old friend of mine, and Arthur just encapsulates these gems that resonate with you for decades. I mean, I wouldn't be standing up here if it weren't for Arthur Clarke. So I put his quote because long before this data stared us in the face, Arthur said, "The rash assertion that God created man in his own image is ticking like a time bomb at the foundation of many faiths. The ticking is getting louder because the data is getting stronger." And I am so pleased to look out and see this room filled. If we had a bigger room, it would be filled, because this is an idea, this is a conversation whose time has come. And we forthrightly, with your absolute sterling participation and showing up, and, you know, what was it, I forget who said that 90% of life is just showing up? Woody Allen. Okay, well, he was right. And you guys have done your part by showing up. We're going to try to get other places in the University of Wisconsin to pick up this ball and to run with it. because this conversation needs to take place all over the country. In fact, all over the world. We have to know what it is we're dealing with, and we have to give people a sense of being able to talk about it before it hits them, oh, I hate this, in the face. I can see that coming. My mind is just, you know, it's going there, and I thought, there's no way to stop. I'm going to fall right up. Anyway, by the way, would someone kind of give me how much time I have? I have an hour. Okay. Okay, lots of time. Ha ha ha. He doesn't know me. Lots of time. Lots of time. Okay. I may go a little over. I just want to warn you, okay? But it'll be worth it, as you'll see. There are some surprises. So I have been searching and thinking and pondering on this conundrum, what I find is the most intractable and fascinating problem, which is, if this stuff on Mars is real, if the face is real and the other stuff we're going to talk about, what does it mean? How do we enter the equation? And in fact, as I wrote in Monuments, I saw back now 20-some years ago that if this was real, it was a almost carbon copy of the scenario laid out in Arthur and Stanley's seminal film, novel, etc., 2001. Because it somehow bespoke of an intervention in the nursery, in another model, by something ineffable, something alien, something from out there that left a monument to that intervention. And of course, 20 years ago, we didn't know what we know now, and we didn't have a lot of the clues as to the dimensions of that potential intervention. And again, we're going to have a really rollicking good time discussing that and other things this evening, because the potential for that intervention directly assaults the superficial reading of Genesis. And there is no other way to say it than that flatly. If aliens have somehow intervened in the human condition, if they exist and have played God, then the chronology and the scriptures and the texts, not only of Christians, but of all faiths. I mean, I wish we had 2 or 3 days, and I wish we had Muslims up here, and we had Buddhists, and we had, you know, a stripe of every potential perspective on who we are and why we are here. Because in order to tackle this, we have to tackle it with nothing less than the whole of the human value system, which has looked at and asked questions as to why we exist from time immemorial. Finally now, we have potential data, which I don't move along, won't get to answer some of these extraordinary questions. And it's time we entered the conversation so that everybody comes up the curve at the same time. Well, that connection, that search, brings us back to Rome. Because Rome, as an empire devoted to the god Mars, the Roman Empire extended from the British Isles all the way up here, all the way down to Egypt, span of several thousand miles covering the entire Mediterranean region. And you can see it in the architecture. If you go to Rome today, you will find something that looks eerily like this. This is the obelisk of Hatshepsut, who was one of the few female pharaohs of Egypt in its heyday. Well, in Vatican Square, standing right in front of the icon of Christendom, St. Peter's, there is an obelisk which was stolen, borrowed from Egypt by the Romans and brought to Rome. Now, why were they intrigued with Egypt? Why did Caesar go to Egypt? Think about the connections between some of what we're going to talk about in terms of Egypt's connections to more distant and ancient places, and what Rome, in the personification of the worship of its god, did with that same information. Anyway, Rome was a descendant of a culture on this peninsula, namely the Greek culture. That's why many times it's called Greco-Roman. You can actually trace, and David is going to trace, a progression of civilizations that have kept sacred the same stuff, have regurgitated it, have reformulated it, have repackaged it. But when you strip away the superficial things, it seems eerily to extend back to Mars. Now, it certainly extends to the concept of Mars, to the concept of a godhood, of a deity to be worshipped. But we're making an even bolder proposal. We're saying that the data now supports the theory, the hypothesis, that in fact it could physically extend back to Mars. And let me tell you how, all right? If you look on an island called Crete in the Mediterranean, you will see a city. No longer exists, lost to now forever in time, a city called Cydonia. That was the origin of the name of Cydonia on Mars, by way of an astronomer, an Italian astronomer in 1877, Giovanni Virginio Schiaparelli, the same Schiaparelli who saw canals and started Lowell on his trek. Schiaparelli was a classicist, and as you'll see in a little while, it wound up with him renaming all of the features on Mars, including some provocative names. Here's one called Eden. Wonder what he meant by that. Anyway, so if you look a little further at the Mediterranean, at the eastern extent of the Roman Empire, you'll see a little city up here on the coast of Syria called Sidon. David is going to get into some very interesting information regarding Sidon, because it turns out that we can trace concepts and beliefs of the people who lived in Sidon, who was another variant of Cydonia, and you'll find that what they believed and where that information came from strengthens the case that we're dealing with a legacy of information. Now, if in fact the information vis-a-vis what's waiting at Cydonia came by circuitous means from a place that is named after Cydonia, except it was transposed, the terrestrial form in historical terms preceded the Martian form in our current nomenclature and current maps and current ideas, ultimately it all revolves around this piece of real estate, which is inarguably the most contentious piece of real estate in the world. Is that an accident? Is that just chance? Or does this potential connection to a profound link between these two worlds, which seems to have touched ground here in some form at a very ancient time, as David will limn out, is it possibly responsible for the current problems in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, and above all, between Israel and all its Arab neighbors? Is it possible that the greatest threat facing mankind in the 21st century ultimately stems from this clash of cultural perspectives around the seminal idea that we have been tinkered with from somewhere else? Do you remember back in 1997 when NASA sent Pathfinder to Mars and two guys from Yemen sued NASA in the court system, claiming that NASA was infringing on their family history and preserve and their culture and their family derived from Mars? No one noticed. No one paid attention. We did. Because my question is, what do they perchance know that no one else knows? Now, getting through the filters from our culture, particularly now that events past September 11th have taken place, to their culture is almost impossible. What do they think they know? So this then was the extent of the Roman Empire. And in Rome itself, there are many monuments the Forum, which is where Caesar spoke and was killed. There's the temple of Mars, Ultor, is back there in the distance. The temple to Mars, the god of war. And if you look at Rome's history in toto, Romulus and Remus, the mythological sons of the war god, were said to have founded Rome. The Romans were therefore known as the sons of Mars. The Roman Empire was the first that we know of specifically dedicated to Mars. Ancient Rome's New Year began March 1, the month of Mars. And finally, Sally priests, who were dedicated to Mars, are the origin of our term salute, and their key ritual dates include March 19th to 23rd. Just as a little footnote, this is the year of Mars, right? If Mars is somehow involved at a deep, fundamental, archetypal level in the turbulent history of the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, the ancient home of Sumer, the first known civilization out of nowhere, out of nothing. Isn't it interesting that the war began March 19th? And it had to happen on a clock. It's now obvious that that war had to happen on a clock. Why? Well, in all of the iterations of monuments over the last, 20-some years, almost 20 years, from 87 to 2003, I have been pursuing this idea of a celestial-terrestrial connection. That if we're looking at real data, if there really is a face and other structures, pyramids, an organized complex, some kind of urban center, some kind of civilization that we are looking down by remote sensing and looking at with satellite imagery, then there has to be, because of the centerpiece of that potential civilization, there has to be a discoverable connection. And I started looking in the direction of Egypt. Now, a lot of you who heard me on art know that I have talked a lot about the surprising, shocking connection of many modern institutions to ancient Egypt, a discovery that we simply, couldn't fathom at the time. We now have a bit of a better perspective, but initially it didn't make any sense. Now, of course, if you undergird that historical displacement of data that doesn't make sense with a foundation of Mars behind us all, if in fact the human condition can trace its connections back to Cydonia, back to Mars, back to whatever happened there, and we're seeing in Egypt as the first touch point on this planet in monumental form its emergence here, then things begin to make a little more sense. And as I said, the guy who's going to make a great deal of sense of this, who's carrying on in a sterling way this tradition of looking for this connection, and who will regale you with some pretty intriguing surprises, including what these things are, all right? I mean, this is really cool, is David Flynn, and I'm dying to see and hear what he has to say later on this morning. Now, another guy who is not with us, but whose presence is very much felt, is this individual, Stanley V. McDaniel. Dr. McDaniel was the professor and former chairman of the Department of Philosophy of Sonoma State University. Back in 1992, he called me up, and he began an independent research project at a university in California looking into the potential reality of the Martian data. He ultimately found so much to write about that he was forced to put together a very large document. We have the only surviving copies. It's now out of print, called the McDaniel Report, of what is in essence a peer review by a world-class epistemologist and historian of science, Professor McDaniel, of all the independent investigations over the last 20 years into this ineffable enigma. And in the sciences, everyone knows that peer review is critical. If you don't have that outside break, that outside perspective, that outside refereed view of what you're doing, it's so easy to go wrong. That's what the whole peer review process is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a colloquy among peers that results in a distillation of truth. Well, Stan McDaniel represents to this investigation in all its many forms, conducted by all of the independent research community, from literally one ocean to the next and even overseas, that peer review. He came to this as a newborn babe. In his own words, he says some very seminal things. For instance, in his summary, this is how he characterized the role of NASA and the rest of us in assessing the reality of what's on Mars. Then he adds, however, during the 17 years, this was written in 1992-93, during the 17 years since the controversial landforms were discovered, 76, NASA has maintained steadfastly there is no credible evidence that any of the landforms may be artificial. A close look at NASA's arguments reveals that NASA's evaluation has consisted largely of initial impressions from unenhanced photographs, heavily weighted by faulty reasoning, and that NASA has failed to apply special methods of analysis. It has relied upon flawed reports. It has failed to attempt verification of the enhancements and measurements made by others, and it is focused exclusively on inappropriate methodology which ignores the importance of context. There remains no scientific basis for NASA's position regarding the Martian landforms. Now that is his summary after a year of independent work, which resulted in a document which was basically sent to NASA in 1993, and literally 3 days, well, I'll wait. I'll tell you what happened in a while. 3 days after NASA received this document, a few copies of which you can now get for yourselves there. Anyway, this is Schiaparelli's first map of Mars showing the infamous canals. You can see his classical nature because on the polar view, with all these place names from around the Mediterranean, he put a Grecian vase imagery. I believe this is Helios, the sun god, pulled by the chariot. And it's obvious why he, of all people, would transpose terrestrial mythology to the planet Mars. To a first order, it was simply because he was steeped in this tradition and thought it would solve a lot of problems with people naming Mars regions after their girlfriends and boyfriends. And I mean, there were all kinds of weird names on Mars before Schiaparelli stepped in and kind of standardized the nomenclature. What I strongly suspect, but can't prove yet, is that Schiaparelli had access to some very ancient documentation, which did what David has done and basically buttressed the conclusion that there was more than a casual link between Mars and regions in the Mediterranean. And that's why we wound up with this interesting Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, with nomenclature from the Mediterranean going back to Mars maps, et cetera, et cetera. Someday we may have enough information if we get to Mars and find the libraries and find out who wrote the documents that wound up on Earth that basically wound up back in the Martian libraries, to figure out if any of this is real. But at least it's an interesting hypothesis based on a number of other things that we're going to, between us, show you this morning. This, of course, is the guy who brought Mars that we presently view with some skepticism. This is Percival Lowell. I had the great privilege of going to Lowell with Robin and with Laurie and looking through his 24-inch telescope this summer during the closest approach in 60,000 years. And I'm looking at Mars now just a shade over 35 million miles away. We're producing a video documentary, which I'm sure you'll all want to see a copy of when we put it out, giving some background and things that you may not know about Lowell and his role in all of this. But more than any other individual, Lowell's Mars gave us the Mars that we thought we would see in the 50s when we sent spaceships to land on Mars and to take stock of what was there. Now, what I find fascinating, going back to this Mediterranean Roman link, is that one of the things that were projected in the artwork of my dear departed friend Chesley Bonstell, who was the first premier space illustrator of the 20th century, who gave birth to a whole host of descendants and devotees and followers of equal artistry and talent, was the transposition of this kind of ruin in downtown Rome into this eerie setting before a Martian dawn. This is what we expected to see. This is what fueled, in fact, at some level still fuels our fascination, I believe, with Mars. We really hope that someone at one time was home. One footnote, notice how thin the columns are compared to the Roman Forum in the previous slide. That's because Chesley was trying to account for the lighter Martian gravity, which would, of course, produce a smaller diameter for the supporting columns for equal weight, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reality, of course, hit us smack in the face in '76, because when this mission went to Mars, as I noted before, among the sand dunes and craters and basically desolate, lifeless environment that we thought that NASA had bequeathed us with these unmanned missions, suddenly this thing appeared. And it was a shock. It was a shock to NASA then, it's a shock to NASA now, and it's becoming a shock to a lot of people the more that become aware that this is a possibility just next door. Now again, this is what Jerry Soffin said. Well, a trick of lighting. In 1980, two gentlemen at Goddard, DiPietro and Molinar, who were independent imaging experts, who worked, I believe, for Lockheed on Landsat imagery at the time, they located the second Viking frame that NASA claimed back then did not exist. This is the original frame on the left. This is 7813 on the right. And as you can see at a higher sun angle, the facial features match point for point and eyeball for eyeball. This is what is called independent confirmation. But how did the scientific community respond to these two independent contractors' discovery of independent data that tended to confirm that this wasn't just an illusion? In fact, it was a real three-dimensional statue. Well, one of them responded like this in Stan McDaniel's volume. Stan says, "My original naive view," he admits he was naive, "that all NASA scientists were sincerely interested in the truth, was utterly shattered when I discovered the most blatant piece of disinformation I've ever seen. One written not by an obscure NASA public information employee, but by a prestigious member of the 1976 Viking lander imaging team, Dr. Carl Sagan. Dr. Sagan's contribution to the subject could not be interpreted as mere scientific bundling. Its author was too knowledgeable for that." And what did Carl say that got Stan so upset? Carl looked at this image and basically said in Parade magazine, "The face in Cydonia, Mars, at left, eerie and haunting. At right, in a separate spacecraft photo, it seems to be an irregular hill." Now, I'm wondering if Carl was still alive, he would look at the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in similar fashion. In other words, it seems to depend upon your prejudices what you see in highly controversial data. But according to Dr. McDaniel's perspectives, there was no way that Carl could not have seen what we all see, which is this thing looks still very face-like at a different sun angle, and to call it an irregular hill is in fact a piece of propaganda. There appears, this is not just my opinion, but the opinion of McDaniel and many others now, there appears to have been an agenda at work as opposed to serious science on this issue for the last 20 or 30 years, which of course, quoting that famous philosopher Arnold Schwarzenegger, where there's smoke, there are fingers. No, where there's smoke, there is fire. Enter this individual. This is Cynthia. She is the resident artiste, sculptress, and artistic director of the Enterprise Mission. I have known Cynthia and worked with her for the last, 20-some years, since '83. That's 20 years. Good God. Where did time go? 20. You know, I can't believe I'm standing up here and saying glibly 20. I've been at this 20 years. Good grief. Anyway, what Cynthia did was to take these two images and produce the first three-dimensional model, long before we had computer image processing that was affordable by us, you know, poor outside independent investigators. She literally took the clay and, based on the high and low sun angle, this one and this one, spent thousands of backbreaking. I mean, have you ever stood over, working with clay? It literally is backbreaking. And she has produced some stunning work, which ultimately was good enough, I felt, to be included as the cover shot of the first edition of the Monuments of Mars. This is her image, her clay model, as you would see it from the city looking across toward the eastern horizon, toward the dawn, photographed by Dan Drayson. Actually a model about, I think it was about this big, shot from one end. Many years later, another member of this dramatis personae, Dr. Mark Carlotto, who was a respected engineer from Carnegie Mellon, worked with highly classified and black and top secret DoD projects and image processing, is probably one of a handful of world-class image processing experts, came to our merry little band, devoted a great deal of time, and produced the first quantitative digital three-dimensional analysis, some of which was published in Applied Optics in 1988. What Mark did was to take the two-dimensional Viking data and, via a technology called photoclinimetry, better known as shape from shading, which is an algorithm that kind of calculates 3D things from Lambert scattering laws and sun angles and geometry and puts it all together and gives you a three-dimensional structure with a couple of assumptions. He produced this rotation back in '88 of the infamous face on Mars. Now, the cool thing is that when you compare Cynthia's analog model here with Mark's digital model there, two different techniques, two different people, two different genders, two different coasts, they're the same, separated by, I think it was 3 or 4 years. Now that's cool. That is independent confirmation of the reality, the objective reality. And of course, what this did was, for once and for all, for any objective observers, throw in the ash can the NASA canard, oh, it's only a trick of light and shadow. Boy, if we had patented that phrase or trademarked it or something, we would be able to fund the Enterprise mission. Hint, hint. Now, Mark has published, as well as, Dr. Horace Crater and Stan McDaniel and many other individuals, a series of technical papers in the journals. It's very hard to get Sidonia into the journals. Tom Van Planern tried with Nature and was told absolutely flat out that Nature had put Sidonia on the prescribed list of topics it would, over its dead body, ever cover scientifically. The prejudice in the scientific community against the idea, even the idea, that there might be an ancient civilization elsewhere in the solar system is absolutely profound. It is redolent. You can cut it with the proverbial knife. This is not science. This is political science. But despite these problems, there have been, over the years, a series of papers published in peer-reviewed journals, technical journals, of the stature of these that were on the screen, of various aspects of the problem of potential artifacts on the planet Mars. So for NASA to say that this has never been within the mainstream scientific community is another absolute falsehood. It has. It's simply being assiduously ignored by the space agency and the political structure which supports it. Now, one of the other things that Mark did was to bring satellite technology from the intelligence world that had been used in, among other things, the first Gulf War, looking at satellite imagery with an eye toward distinguishing natural objects from artificial objects. This is called a fractal technology, based on the idea that natural landscapes are self-similar, and if you have an artificial object like a tank sitting on a natural surface, you will get a deviation in measuring pixels in a computer that will allow you to make a educated inference as to the degree of artificiality, and then you target the tank with a tow missile, and bingo, you're in the scenario that is currently going on. Well, Mark took the same technology and applied it to Mars. This is an example. This is a picture of, I think, a B-52 at some Air Force base. I think it's Otis Air Force Base up in New England. Used to live not far from there. And this is the computer fractal plot, and the brightest thing in the image is the most non-natural, non-fractal, i.e. artificial. And when you apply this to the face on Mars, lo and behold, the face stands out as the most non-natural of any object down there, which back in 1992, when these results were published, caused me in that edition of Monuments to basically say that the face was not carved like Mount Rushmore, but in fact was probably made of artificial stuff. It was built. It was a construction. It was high technology, not simple sandstone or Mount Rushmore lying on the Cydonia Plain. Now, if you look carefully at these plots, this is now background on Mars for the fractal results. This is the face. You'll notice that the curve is steeper and the separation at midpoint from the natural slope line is greater than the one for the tank. Now, this is the plot. This is the terrestrial standardization. Here's the tank. Here's the face. Notice the curve is sharper and the separation from the line greater for the face on Mars than for the most outstanding unnatural object in the Iraqi desert during the Gulf War. Oh, this is an analysis of the whole Cydonia region, showing that the most non-fractal things on the planet in that region are the fort in the city. I'll show you that in a minute. And the face is way out there. Now, has NASA paid any attention at all to these numerical results? No. Which brings us back to McDaniel, because he said, the use of enhancement imagery to compensate for inherent characteristics of satellite and spacecraft photography is standard. Methods of image cleanup, magnification, digital analog contrast control, photoclinometry, and fractal analysis used by the researchers are proven procedures based upon the most advanced technology. He's talking about us guys. The researchers who have developed this data are qualified and experienced professionals. That's McDaniel talking about Carlotto. Research results have been confirmed in several instances by cross-comparison between techniques and between different Viking frames. That's the fractal versus the visual imagery, etc. Geometric measurements at Cydonia, that's our stuff, have been carried out using orthographically rectified images obtained from NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey, and are based upon an official updated control grid. There is no reason to question the validity of the hard data within reasonable tolerances, which of course is exactly 180 degrees from what NASA says. He then goes on to say, as my study of the work done by the independent investigators and NASA's response to their research continued, I became aware not only of the relatively high quality of the independent research, but also of glaring mistakes in the arguments used by NASA to reject this research. With each new NASA document I encountered, I became more and more appalled by the impossibly bad quality of the reasoning used. It grew more and more difficult to believe that educated scientists could engage in such faulty reasoning unless they were following some sort of hidden agenda aimed at suppressing the true nature of the data. Now again, that's not me, that's Professor Stan McDaniel after a year of very hard work. Now, if that's true, it makes what happened in 1993 all the more insidious, because that was the year that we were supposed to send the spacecraft to follow Viking Mars Observer back to Mars and get our next set of pictures of, among other places, if we really tried, Cydonia. And NASA, kicking and screaming, and Mike Malin, kicking and screaming even more, said, in essence, over our dead bodies. And then 3 days after McDaniel's report with these scathing indictments of a NASA procedure gone radically wrong, is that an echoed foreshadowing of what the recent CAIB report has said in another dimension of NASA's work? An agency which has gone radically wrong? Is it possible, as I said on Nori's program one night, that because this stuff doesn't kill people, it simply has been simmering in the drawer as an undercurrent for decades with no one paying attention, because of course the news media and people in general are only focusing on those things which touch their lives, and when you lose 7 astronauts, that touches your life. But what about losing the history and future of mankind? What's the measure of that? Is that what this agency has really done to us? And have they ultimately shortchanged us for the most profound discussion of all, which is why we are here today, which is, what is the meaning of this? If the ruins are there and they're real and they somehow have touched us, what does it mean for the profound beliefs of human beings all over this planet regarding who they are, where they came from, and why they exist? Those are the questions that must be addressed now as the data gets stronger and stronger. Well, a couple of days after that report was delivered, McDaniel, to NASA, this happened. NASA lost the Mars Observer spacecraft. Poof, just disappeared. And to this day, no one really knows what happened. Why? Because they very cleverly turned off the telemetry just before they were going to make the burn into Mars orbit. Now, without telemetry, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know what happens. You have no information. So the Coffee report, the official review of what happened to Mars Observer, was basically based on guesses. And they guessed it blew up. Well, I guessed it didn't. And I said as much on CNN. And that's a long story, and we don't have time to go into it. Fast forward the film now. It's 1997. A spacecraft called Mars Surveyor has just gone into orbit on Mars. By the way, anybody here know the night, the literal date when Mars Surveyor was placed in Mars orbit of 1997? I remember this the other day, and it kind of freaked me out because it's one of those things that you go, whoa. No. September 11th, 1997. That's a whole other conference, okay? Anyway, beginning with Mars Surveyor, we were able to get this image. This is the so-called cat box image made famous by my friend Art, who very appropriately described it, you know, and I will immortalize to my dying day Art's seminal way with words. He said, "Damn it, it looks like a cat box." Because it did. It was taken under the worst lighting, at the worst angle, the worst this, the worst that. And when Dan Rather took one look at it, he said, nothing there. That renowned geologist, Dan Rather, of course. And Peter Jennings followed suit and said, I don't see any face there. And so that was it. Everybody's gone away. What they don't realize, of course, is that other images have been taken. This is the original Viking high sun angle. This is the cat box image. This is the 2001 full face view. This is the Odyssey view taken a few months ago. All of these images, over and over and over again, when they come out, what does NASA say? This is the high sun angle full face view taken by Mike Malin. Look at this incredible symmetry of the platform. Look at the dimension, look at the facial features. People who had never been involved in the whole Mars controversy took one look at this picture, and in an MSNBC poll, it turned out that more people thought that this thing was artificial after the image was made public, even despite the NASA propaganda, than thought before the picture was taken. So there's this disconnect between where people are going with just looking at this thing as the data gets better and where officialdom has been and continues to be. Then, of course, this is the 2001 Odyssey mission, named after Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick's famous film, which I've had high hopes for, and it turns out that this spacecraft has given us some stunning data, which you're going to see momentarily, which is taking us in a whole new direction on this conundrum, and may, in fact, foreshadow a political breakthrough that I'm going to talk about in a minute. This is what NASA has said as of the recent imagery. Now, when the 2001 image came out, this is the date here, May 24, 2001, it used this 26-year-old image of Cydonia, unenhanced with the bit hits and the little nostril from the data dropout in the transmission. In other words, it seems to have decided that history stopped with the first press release back in '76, and we don't care what those damn independent guys think or write or publish. We know this thing is just a pile of rocks, so take it. And they do it again and again and again, except look down here what they say here, which is eerie. It's like there's this doublespeak. It says, scientists figured it was just another Martian mesa, common enough around Cydonia, only this one had unusual shadows that made it look like an Egyptian pharaoh. Now, why the heck does NASA have to say it's an Egyptian pharaoh? If it's a pile of rocks, just say it's a pile of rocks. Why connect it ritually to what we know they're doing with all their Egyptian stuff that we don't have time this morning to go into? But you can go to enterprisemission.com and you can see a lot of it there. It turns out, in the history of Viking, Mars Surveyor, and Mars Odyssey, that Cydonia is the most photographed region on the planet Mars, bar none. By principal investigators, Malin and Christensen, these guys keep saying it's nothing but a pile of rocks, but they keep taking pictures. What's wrong with this picture? I mean, if it's just a pile of rocks, just leave it alone. Go do something important. You know, get a girlfriend, anything. But why keep taking pictures of a place that you say publicly is just a pile of rocks? In other words, to me, the NASA experience has foreshadowed my experience with the entire U.S. government. I mean, just try traveling by plane these days, and you will see that between what they say and what they do, there is a total disconnect. And in the political campaign shaping up for the White House next year, you're going to see this played out on every network in real time, because more and more people are beginning to realize there's something wrong with what we're being told in all kinds of areas. And to make Robin happy, I'll say including health. All right, so this was the official Odyssey relief that Christensen wrote after this image. The Odyssey image was taken a few months ago. The so-called face on Mars. In this famous visible image, this 3-kilometer-long knob located, etc., etc., was first imaged by the Viking spacecraft in the 1970s and seen by some, gosh, I wonder who I think that refers to resemble the face carved into the rocks of Mars. Since that time, the Mars Orbiter camera on the Mars Global Surveyor spacecraft has provided detailed views of this hill that clearly shows that it's a normal geologic feature with slopes and ridges carved by eons of wind and downslopes motion due to gravity. Oh, yeah? I mean, there is this disconnect, because I'm telling you, people who have never seen this, look at this, particularly kids, who, of course, don't come with baggage to this. And I've had countless emails and faxes and all that from people who say, you know, I heard you on art, I went to the website, I was looking at some of the imagery, and my, 9-year-old son came into the room. And he said, Dad, what are you looking at that face on the computer screen for? Where is that? I mean, this has happened so many times. It's not scientific, of course, but if we ever had some money, it would be nice to do a poll to show people who've never seen this what it looks like, and just ask them, what do you think it looks like? I will bet you dollars to Navy beans that it will look like what it is. Which brings us to the pièce de résistance. God, I actually can say that this morning, of this 20-year odyssey. Had to do it again. About a year ago, on October 24th of 2002, a photograph was taken by the Odyssey spacecraft looking down at 90.3 degrees. And I talked a bit with Art about this and with George, but you guys probably didn't get to see the pictures. This, I think, is the breakthrough we all have been waiting for very, 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 very patiently. Because in this image, this dawn image, the face, compared to objects except for the D and M down here, and I'll get to that in a minute, the face is extraordinarily bright. Now, why is this anomalous? Why does this kind of flag our attention? Well, the amount of brightness, if you actually do a simple gamma adjust, in other words, you basically just turn down the brightness in the computer, which we've done in a series of steps here. That's what each of these images represents. If you turn down the brightness and you accept the literature value for the reflectivity of the Martian surface at Cydonia of around 20%, it turns out that the face is over 99% reflective on the eastern side. Furthermore, there is an astonishing geometry visible on the eastern side, which if you tilt your head a little bit to the left, like that, you go that way, you'll see it lines up parallel with the center line. I'll show you some other comparisons so you don't have to imagine what's over here in the darkness. When I saw this, here's the comparison. Here's MGS, full face view. Get this, this is not a dawn image. The 90.3 degrees should have been a dead giveaway. It's pre-dawn. The sun is 0.3 of a degree below the horizon. One of our esteemed colleagues from England, I believe, calculated that in order to see the sun, you would have to be 9,000 feet over the face, hovering in a spacecraft to see the sun just peeking over the horizon. So this brightness on the eastern side is before the sun has risen. Now, the Martian air is 1/100th of the pressure of the air you're breathing. That means, to a first order, its scattering potential, its scattering brightness is 100 times less efficient. So pre-dawn at 4:39 in the morning, which is when this photograph was taken, Martian time, is damn dark. It's dark down there. So how come this is so incredibly bright? It's because it's incredibly reflective. Now, one of the possibilities raised by Christensen at Caltech during the JPL seminar on Mars and missions to Mars and all that this summer suggested very obliquely that maybe this brightness was due to snow on the eastern side. Well, this is what snow looks like in our own deserts in New Mexico on Shiprock, with the sun actually risen. And you'll notice that snow is a Lambert scatter. It's like this movie screen, all right? It scatters light in all directions. This is not a Lambert scatterer, and it in no way compares. I mean, you can see detail in the shadow, kind of, detail in the shadow, but look how dull this looks in bright sunlight compared to this pre-dawn. Again, I emphasize this is a pre-dawn image. 90.3 degrees. Now here's what that translates to. This is a Viking image taken just after sunset back in '76 by the Viking lander. All right, you can see shadowy features here. This is the wing cover of the Viking lander. This is some of the surface instruments, the landing pads. This is the horizon. There's a crater on the horizon. This is a bright bluish glow caused by forward scattering in the Martian atmosphere. But notice how dark the landscape is, and this wind cover is gray. You know, it's about 50–60% reflective. Notice how dark it is. And it's a Lambert scatter. It's gray paint. It's basically, it's like a movie screen. But it's dark because the Martian pre-dawn or post-sunset is dark. But when we look at the face in that kind of lighting, with the sunlight coming from the northeast, this is the angle, the sun is rising way over here, this is how bright it is compared to what you can see on the left. And the geometry of this indicates that it's coming from that large halo of light above the sun in the atmosphere. It's a diffuse halo, so you don't have sharp shadows. There's no shadow extending out. So that's why this slope, this base of the face is in darkness, because it's tilted away from that light part of the sky, so it's not getting any light at all. It's seeing the sky over here, which is dark, all right? But look at how incredibly bright, and more important, how incredibly geometric the eastern side is. Now here's a comparison between the Malin image, close-up, 1.5 meter res, and the Odyssey image pre-dawn. Now we begin to see that there are hints of color. Is it possible that this is some kind of glass-like material? Is it prismatically diffracting and refracting this pre-dawn glow as well as reflecting it? And if so, what are the physics of that? Well, Mark Carlotto, many years ago, based on his shape from shading analysis, produced a three-dimensional model that he then proceeded to light in the computer from dawn to dusk. And it turned out this is the lighting that most approximates the current Odyssey lighting that we have, except with Mark's version, the sun was up. It's actually, you know, you can see sunlight coming in. Now what's interesting is to compare the differences and the similarities in Mark's view. This is his view. This is another Viking shot. This shows you, by the way, how dark the surface is even when the sun is literally just risen, given the dust and the distance and all that on Mars. Sunrise is a dim phenomenon, as is sunset, but not when you're looking down on the face from orbit. Now this is a comparison of Mark's computer simulation lit by sunrise and the actual photography. Notice that he got some things right. This ridge here, which we think is part of the facial features, conforms to this, and that slope is very bright as it is here. But his nose reflection and his eye reflections are completely missing here, and it's overwhelmed by all this other stuff going on, which is so geometric that all you can say is it's not a Lambert scatter. It's not a diffuse surface. It's acting much more like a mirror. Now here are some diffuse surfaces made of natural rock that one of our friends in Sedona, Matt Nelson, took a few weeks ago. This is just before sunset. This is outcroppings, you know, sandstone outcroppings in Sedona. Notice the sunlit side. Notice the away-facing side. Notice that the brightness is absolutely has nothing to do with what we're seeing in the Odyssey image. Here's another version just before sunset. These buttes are lit by the sun coming like this. Here's the shadow. There's no overwhelming brightness compared to the darkness that we see in the Odyssey data. This is the moon. I think it's a first quarter moon, judging by the angles and when this would have been taken and all that. So how do we explain this astonishing asymmetry in the brightness? Well, I have said from the beginning that this thing was a made object based on the fractal data that Mark gave us back in 1992. This is a model in the computer done by Fred Torres, who works with Kinthea. This is a computer rendering, basically making the face a glass-like specular reflecting surface. And as you can see, it reproduces some of the asymmetry, but not really. In other words, even glass with a front surface reflection doesn't match the incredible brightness of the face on Mars. What does match the brightness is a version of this computer rendering. This is a specular reflection ray trace set of diagrams published on the web that I was able to find. This object is a donut. It's got facets. As you rotate the facets around, the flat planar mirrors catch the light, beam it to the camera, and you see these bright reflections and flash it toward you. I mean, you've all seen the same phenomena flying into airports where you see windshields or you see sunset on buildings facing the west. Seattle is a good place. Even in Albuquerque, we have some buildings up on the foothills which at certain times of the afternoon will shine brilliantly. And I've tried taking some pictures, and none of them come out because they overwhelm the CCD pixels of the camera. They're so bright compared to the background. All in all, then, what I believe we're looking at is basically an object which has a mirror-like construction on the eastern side. That, in fact, is an object which has part of its architecture still surviving on the protected side. Remember, the destruction and the winds of Mars come in from the west, so this side has been beaten to hell. This side is more protected, and so this side has the architectural layout and geometry of whatever grand structural foundational architecture that this thing was made of back when it was new. And this data is so profound. Now again, the reason I can say this with some confidence is based on this fractal data. Notice that even on this side, with the sun coming in from the west, this is the most non-fractal object on the surface. And the bottom line is, the face on Mars unequivocally appears to be a manufactured object that does not belong on that Martian landscape. If you look at some of the other nearby objects, it turns out that on this analysis, which is a color image taken looking straight down, pre-dawn, we've got the most incredible, incisive analytical tool that we've ever had. And of course, my question is, why did we get it? The fact that this came from Arthur's mission, 2001 Mars Odyssey. If you look nearby the face, you'll see objects which appear to be mesas. At least that's what they've been called. In fact, if you look very carefully, you'll see that there are checkerboards here and straight lines and an eerie bluish cast. Now, how can red rocks covered with red oxidized Martian dirt look blue? I mean, where'd the blue come from? And if you go closer and rotate with a little more processing, remember, Stan says that we're doing this by the numbers, we find that there is an incredible geometric array of structure across this object with beautiful straight lines, sweeping curves, symmetry. Here's one wing, here's another wing, all right? This is the west wing. Hey, couldn't resist. Sorkin gave us a show, why don't we, you know? This thing may not be a mesa after all. In fact, this is in keeping with some of the data that came out from the infrared study, which I don't have time to go into today, indicating that there's a lot more going on in Cydonia when you get new information, new technology, new tools, than even we potentially speculated even a few years ago. And finally, if you look at this object, this is now another object that at low resolution, you know, it's another mesa, okay. But if you zoom in this color view, pre-dawn, this is what you see. It looks as if this object, again, is strikingly colored blue, indicating short wavelength scattering, internal scattering in some glass-like material, and it's incredibly geometric. It's got boxy stuff, ruined boxy stuff. Look at this beautiful corner of basically a cube. If you draw the whole thing, this is a ruined set of cubes lying there a mile or so across in this desert not too far from the face, strikingly different, but just a couple of miles away from the face itself. Now, how on a place where there's supposed to be no geology, where nothing has ever changed, do you get radically different features right next door to each other? On Earth, even with pretty vigorous geology, we find that within a few miles, things tend to be the same. Geological landforms tend to be the same. Not apparently at Cydonia. Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't get to, of course. Hopefully we'll have a chance to get to some of them in our afternoon discussions. and our evening Q&A and round robin with the other panelists that I share the stage with. So let me leave you with this thought. We stand at a really important point in the entire 20-year Sidonian investigation. We have almost incontrovertible evidence now that whatever this is, it's not a natural pile of rocks, regardless of what NASA says. What we need is better data of the same kind, pre-dawn or post-sunset shots, and we have formally approached the Mars Express people with the German camera on the European mission going to Mars, and I can make some news by telling you that Dr. Newcomb, who is the principal investigator of the German camera, has assured several Enterprise members in emails that they fully intend to use the 2-meter color camera to attempt to resolve the Sidonia question, including taking pre-dawn and post-sunset imagery, as I called for when I did the show with George some months ago. So, all I can say is stay tuned. Thank you.